Please join me in welcoming Pakou Hang up to the stage.
Can I just say that the energy and the love in this room is so amazing, and I just want to thank you all for creating this space for all of us to be a part of. Before I begin, I just want to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this conference, and especially the staff from MIF, Jen and Lauren. Thank you so much for your invitation for me to speak this afternoon. My name is Pakou Hang, and I'm honored to be here with you all at the annual Michigan Family Farmers Conference. More importantly, I'm honored to stand alongside you all as we dream and fight for a more equitable and fair food system and a fair farming world. There's an old Chinese curse that says something along the lines of, may you live in interesting times. And this past week, from the Iowa caucuses to the acquittal of the president to last night's firing of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Viterman, to me, has definitely felt like we are living in very interesting times. The world does seem a little upside down. For example, last year we saw the relocation of over 547 USDA employees from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City, Missouri, in the name of cost saving and streamlining, with many staff members deciding actually not to move. These folks were researchers and scientists who were doing work on a number of topics, including climate change. But I don't have to tell you that we are experiencing for real rapid swings from torrential rainstorms to long bouts of droughts, from more frequent fires to unsuspected pests and soil diseases. In the State of the Union last Tuesday night, we heard from the president that the incomes are soaring, poverty is plummeting, and that the American fortunes are all on the rise. But I don't have to tell you, according to reports released by the United States Court this week, U.S. farm bankruptcies have hit an 8-year all-time high. Family farmers filed 595 bankruptcies this past year, up from 498 last year. The data also shows that such filings, known as family farmer bankruptcies, has steadily increased every year for the past 5 years. Now, in January, the Gallup News Poll released their decennial happiness report. They do this every 10 years. And they found that the vast majority, right, 86% of Americans reported being very happy or fairly happy. But I don't have to tell you that the suicide rate for farmers, operators, and farm workers have and are more than 3 times higher than the national rates dating back to the 1990s and the early 2000s. I don't have to tell you these weird things that seem to not make sense because, like you, I am living in this world. We are all living in this world. Our country is more and more polarized. Wealth is more consolidated than ever. And the American dream seems less and less possible for more and more of us. So, in these times, in this moment, what are we called to do? And that is what I want to talk to you all about this afternoon. As Jen mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of an organization called the Hmong American Farmers Association, also known as HAFA. And for the past 8 years, I was HAFA's executive director. We are a membership-based nonprofit located in St. Paul, Minnesota, that works with over 100 Hmong farmers in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. Despite their hard work and vast experiences, Hmong farmers continue to be disadvantaged when accessing farmland, new markets besides the farmers' markets, capital, credit, research, and training programs, compared to other white vegetable, fruit, and flower growers. Based on our research, the average Hmong farmer earned only 65% of what the average white vegetable grower in Minnesota was earning. And we thought this was unacceptable. So HAFA was created to foster equity in the food and farming industries and to dramatically change the landscape for Minnesota Hmong farmers. Our mission is to advance the economic prosperity of our farmers through policy and systems change, community engagement and advocacy, and individual capacity building so that our farmers can grow their own intergenerational and community wealth. We believe that good intentions alone will never get us to parity with other white farmers, and that a just and equitable food system requires a shift in power. Thus, our theory of change is rooted in a whole foods approach, which asserts that all aspects of the food and farming system, land, markets, capital, training, and research, all of that must be simultaneously and freely accessible to immigrant farmers to truly build intergenerational and community wealth. Now, people often ask us, how will you know that you've been successful? And we say, we know that we will be successful or that we have been successful when we've organized ourselves out of a job. And we believe truly that we will get there one day because of three things. First, we use community organizing tactics that are fundamentally about people coming into their own political consciousness. Second, we work with whole families and cohorts of farmers because systems change requires masses of people organized. And lastly, we bring people together because change will never come without a collective consciousness. So now, one of the wonderful things about working at HAFA was that I was constantly in touch with my culture. And Hmong culture is very much a culture that values remembering. Perhaps it was because we did not have our own country, or that we don't have a written language, or that historically our people have been spread out across many continents. But in Hmong culture, looking back or remembering is actually how we move forward. In fact, one of our most important ceremonies, the funeral ritual, begins with the shaman walking with the spirit of the deceased person. And they go back to each house the deceased person had lived in, and they literally take a broom and they sweep the essence of that person's spirit until they get to the place where the deceased person had been born. And in our culture, we believe that that space is actually the portal into the afterlife, and only then can the funeral ritual begin. Remembering in Hmong culture is how we move forward. And so for the question we are asked today, in these times, in this moment, what are we called to do? I think we need to look back at other times in US history when we have been polarized and divided, and how did we meet the moments and the questions of that moment. Immediately, I think about the time after the Civil War and the vast efforts to make a life for formerly enslaved people. Efforts to rebuild the South and to heal a country that was not only relearning how to be united, but was in shock after the traumatic assassination of a beloved president. I think about this man named Oliver Hudson Kelley, who was at that time an employee at the Department of Agriculture, and who took a tour of the South to assess the damages and to try to find out what he could do to help. What he saw and what he learned was appalling. He saw that there were tons of people who lacked knowledge around sustainable agriculture. So he began an organization that would later be known as the Grains. This organization was the first farmers' advocacy organization in the United States. Oliver Kelley would say, everybody is progressing, everything is progressing, why not the farmer? And so he brought farmers together for education, advocacy, and social purposes. They formed cooperatives, taught classes, supported causes like the women's suffrage movement, and educated people about the political process. They fought back against railroad owners and rail elevator operators who were charging crazy prices to transport farmers' produce, and they won. I also think about the time during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, when large farms in California relied on immigrant and minority farm workers, but weren't willing to pay for their wages, for their labor. I think about Chicana organizer Dolores Huerta and Filipino American organizers Larry Itlong Lee, who founded the Agricultural Workers Association, which is made up of Filipino, Chicano, Anglos, and Black farm workers. And I also think about Cesar Chavez, who grew up in a farm working family and vowed to make a better life for those around him. We all know about the famous Great Boycott in 1965, when Latino workers joined with Filipino workers in Delano, California, to fight for $1.25 an hour wage. The boycott lasted 5 years, 5 long years, but eventually they saw those wages in the formation of a workers' union. It was Dolores's, Larry, and Caesar's vision and values that spearheaded the United Farm Workers Association, which organized and used direct action to create better working conditions and wages for farm workers. And they won. And more recently, I think about the farm crisis in the 1980s and the carnage of small farmers losing the land their grandparents and great-grandparents farmed to the banks and to the creditors. My political mentor, Paul Wellstone, came out of that movement. He led marches in solidarity with pork factory workers and got arrested at banks that were foreclosing on farms. In fact, I recall the story that Paul told me when he said that before every protest, he had to check with his wife, Sheila, to make sure they had enough money in the bank account in case he got arrested, they needed bail money. Out of the farm crisis of the 80s, paradoxically though, we also saw the start of community-supported agriculture. We saw increases in people being interested in organic certification. And we saw farm activists running for public office and winning, like Senator Paul Wellstone. I often think, what would Paul say to me now if I asked him, in these times, in this moment, what are we called to do? I actually found an old video of him back in the mid-1990s after he had just won the senatorial race in Minnesota. And he was in Kentucky, of all places, meeting with a room full of people about not letting despair overcome them in troubling times. And in this video, he said to them, first, we have to build on the strength of any community, and that strength is its people. Then we have to help the people believe that they are the ones that they have been waiting for. And lastly, we have to give people direction and organize through citizens' action. So what are we called to do in these times and in this moment? First, I think we are called to pay attention. Even if it is exhausting, even if it breaks our hearts, even if it makes us so sad and mad we're swearing and we want to throw stuff, we must bear witness. Second, we must organize. What is organizing but the act of people coming together in solidarity towards a common direction to build power? And power is the ability to act. So as long as we can act, we have power and we can change things, and we must. And lastly, we cannot give up. I think about the poet Dr. Clarissa Estes, who wrote a letter to a young activist during troubled times. And she said, I have heard from so many recently who are deeply and properly bewildered. They are concerned about the state of affairs in our world right now. It is true, one has to have strong kahunas and ovaries to withstand much of what is past for good in our culture today. Abject disregard of what the soul finds most precious and irreplaceable, and the corruption of principled ideals have become, in such large societal arenas, the new norm. The grotesque of this week. It is hard to say which one of the current egregious matters have rocked people's world and beliefs more. Ours is a time of almost daily, jaw-dropping astonishment and often righteous rage over the latest degradation of what matters most, the civilized, visionary people. She continues, you are right in your assessment. The luster and hubris some have aspired to while endorsing acts so heinous against children, elders, everyday people, the poor, the unguarded, the helpless, is breathtaking. Yet, I urge you, ask you, gentle you to please not spend your spirit dry by bewildering these difficult times. Especially, do not lose hope. Most particularly because the fact is, we were made for these times. Yes, for years we have been learning, practicing, been in training for, and just waiting to meet on this exact plane of engagement. I cannot tell you often enough that we are definitely the leaders we have been waiting for, and that we have been raised since childhood for this moment exactly. Dr. Essie's words speak so keenly to me, as should to you, because who are the people who are the most hopeful people in the whole world? Who are those happy fools that believe that miracles can happen the most? Farmers are those people. Farmers are people who take a small seed, a small little hard seed, and put it into the ground and believe. They believe in their heart that a few months from now, it will spring up a mouth-watering cucumber or a juicy, delicious watermelon. Even in times of rain or times of prolonged drought, even after 20-hour days on our knees, farmers still believe that if you work the land will always give back to you. And that is our gift. Not everyone has that gift. For some, it's too heavy a burden, like Frodo and the Ring of Doom, right? Not everyone can carry that special gift. But for those in this room and for the people you work with, you are the ring bearers. You are strong enough, and you must let your gift shine. And not just shine to restore our upside-down world, but to reform our broken system, to transform our worlds so that it is right and works for all, especially the most vulnerable among us. That is what we are called to do in these times, to shine and light a new way forward. And I am honored to walk along you on that journey. Thank you. Thank you so much. I thought what we could do with the time that we have allotted is maybe open up the floor and either have a discussion or do some questions and answers. So my question to you is, do you think that we're doing enough in Michigan to push forward equitable policies around food and farming? No. And why do you think we're, so the answer down here was no. Why do you think that is? You all are folks right on the ground, right? You're talking, you see both the obstacles, but you also are seeing the real effects of people who don't have access to food or to infrastructure to grow food. Why do you think we are not getting support that we need among our decision makers?
A lot of the money for research into agriculture comes from industry.
Very good point. So what was your name? Sarah. So Sarah says she thinks that the reason, can you all hear me? Okay, so Sarah said that she thinks the reason why there is such a disconnect between what we're seeing on the ground and public policy is because the money that's coming to fuel that work is actually driven or gotten by industry. And so it's in their self-interest to keep the status quo. Who agrees with Sarah? Right. But the industry is just a special interest group, right? Do we think that we're bigger than the special interests? Do we think that there are more people that eat our food than the folks who work for the special interests? Yes. Yeah. Another question?
As this conference is working to reach out to a more diverse community, and maybe selfishly, because you are our keynote speaker today, I had hoped that we would have more members of the Hmong community here.
Sure.
I live in Lansing. And in Lansing, we have a fairly large Hmong community. So I guess my question to you is, do you have suggestions as to how we might reach out to that community? And there are others community too, but I'm gonna say that one specifically right now, sure, to get more individuals coming to this conference. We also have a youth portion so people can bring their families, bring their children, and so that the children are engaged in activities, learning about agriculture and natural resources while their parents are in workshops. So what can we do to reach out more to the Hmong community? I know we have it in Lansing. I don't know what other communities have.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And in order for me to answer that, is it okay if I do a little bit of a history lesson? Right? So how many people here know of Hmong people? Okay, great. So in the United States, there are over about 200,000 Hmong people. And actually, that's just like a small town, right? But we have percolated, I think, our reputation because in whatever places that we have been resettled in, whether it was Lansing, Michigan, or Missoula, Montana, or Fresno, California, or St. Paul, Minneapolis in Minnesota, our community got really involved in farming. And our resettlement happened in the late 70s, early 80s, and that was actually during that time of the farm crisis, but also of the resilience or the resurgence of farmers markets. And so really just kind of serendipitously, Hmong farmers then began being the producers at these farmers markets. And as the farmers markets were energized and revitalized, Hmong farmers became more and more and bigger and bigger. And so right now, especially in Minnesota, but I think across the country, if any city has really a vibrant farmers market, most likely there are Hmong farmers there. Now, Michigan is very interesting because while in Lansing, there were some folks who did farming, most of the Hmong folks were resettled actually in Detroit. And they were put into jobs, and they also got involved in the food system, but not on the farming side, on the restaurant side. So in the early 80s to 90s to early 2000s, you saw a lot of Chinese restaurants that were actually owned and operated by Hmong families. And so my clan is the Hang clan, and I know I had probably about 7 or 8 uncles and cousins who were restaurant owners in Detroit, or they were some of those proprietors. They would have the sushi business where they would make sushi and they would deliver it to the grocery stores, with your little sushi containers. So that's how many of the Hmong folks in Detroit got involved with the food systems work, right? But to answer your question about how can we both reach out to Hmong folks, but also to young people, I want to say that Hmong people in so many ways are not different from other farming families in that our parents did it, right? For myself, we had to do it because my parents wanted to send us to private schools, to Catholic schools, and we couldn't pay for it. So we started growing produce and selling at the farmer's market to pay for the tuition. And then we all grew up, we got the education, and we didn't want to do it anymore. And this echoes a lot of farming families, right? You grew up on the farm and you're like you're doing the chores because your parents are forcing you to. And then you got a college education, which your parents wanted you to have, and you left and you swore you were never gonna come back, right? This is not so different. And I think to answer your question is we, number one, have to recognize that, but also have to change the mindset of what we think of farming. For I think many of my peers who grew up in that world, we still think of farming as something that was a chore. It was a sense of guilt. It was something that our parents did and we didn't necessarily see value in it. And at my organization, the Hmong American Farmers Association, we're trying to reframe this and say, actually, this is your family business. Instead of saying like, oh, my parents farm, we're saying your parents are entrepreneurs. They're owners in a family business, right? So I think number one, we have to reframe the way that we think of, especially people of color, our relationship with agriculture. Because oftentimes it's a relationship that is full of sorrow and cloaked with a lot of oppression. So we have to reframe that. And then also I think what we have to do is we have to recognize then that we have to invite younger people, beginning farmers who maybe don't come from a farming background, but young people who are interested. We have to actually create programs to energize them. And I know at the Hmong American Farmers Association, we're trying to do that, but in our efforts, we have to recognize that the way that we train people who don't come from a farming background is different from the way that we train folks who grew up farming. And so we have to change too to make sure that the way that we're really focusing on we're actually delivering the right tools and information for that particular audience. Did that answer your question? Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? I think there's one way up there.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. In Cuba, they pay the farmers more than they do the doctors, lawyers, pilots. And I think one day, when people in this country realize that we need the youth, and we also need them to understand that it is dignified opportunity and that stigma that just brown and black people can only do this if they cannot do anything else.
Absolutely.
Because if we do not have farmers, we won't live. And that's how they know in Cuba, and they're doing a lot of wonderful work there.
That's such a good point. And can I add to that? I actually think that part of that is because in our country, because it's a capitalist country, we don't value labor, right? We value intellect. We value, people thinking really hard. That's why we pay a CEO 500 times more than the janitor, right? But some people would argue that the janitor's job is just as important, if not more important, than the CEO. So I would argue then it's the truth. So I would argue that, first of all, we don't value physical labor, number one. And number two, most of the people who do physical labor in this country are Black and brown people, or women, right? So because of those dynamics, we especially don't value physical labor. And you're absolutely right. You know, if only people had to grow their own food to survive, then very quickly, farmers would be billionaires, right? Let's be honest. I work with farmers, but I buy my food from them because I can't grow my own tomatoes. It's very hard work. And so I think we have to recognize that and have a reshift. Any other questions?
Thank you for your presentation too. Really appreciate it. And I just got started in this journey recently, but what I'm super passionate about is food in schools and kids. And so when I started down this journey, I started thinking about the farming and how we can get more of it and everything. But then I paused because I realized that in order to grow it, we have to teach kids the importance of it and teach kids that food literacy and where their food comes from and how that fuels their body. And we fail at that a lot. I constantly hear my son come home and say, "Dad, I am the kid that eats a spinach salad and vegetables for lunch. Why does John get Pop-Tarts for his lunch? Why does he get potato chips for his lunch? And so why am I considered the outcast, you know?" And so I guess my question is, like, I am deeply connected into figuring out what food literacy looks like so that every student in school understands where their food comes from, and that going to a farmer's market and getting local farm food should not be a luxury.
Yeah.
It should be a must.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what your story reminds me, when we started the Hmong American Farmers Association farm, we had a bunch of Head Start kids come, and it was right around June or July, so the cucumbers had just started coming in. And so we just had these small little cucumbers and we passed them around and people were eating them. And I remember one little boy, must have been maybe 4, he's like, "What is this? This is so good." And he says, "This is a cucumber." He's like, "This is not how a cucumber tastes like." And we were like, "No, for real, this is how it is," right? And every time when they come back, they always want to have whatever fruit or vegetables in season. And studies have shown that if you actually are able to capture kids' taste buds around 3 or 4 years old, those early years, you actually increase their repertoire, the space in their mind to think about different flavors, right? And so you have to start young, and that's exactly why schools are so critical, because they are that placeholder for it. But I think that it's wonderful for us to say and romanticize farm to school, but we actually have to put money and resources behind it, right? I know that in Minnesota, we were advocating for just a 2-cent increase per meal. And we would raise enough money from that 2-cent increase to actually hire coordinators, to actually work with farmers and the school lunch folks to actually, get that farm to school. Because for so long, even our cafeterias have been engineered to not have local foods, right? We were working with the Minneapolis Public Schools the very first year back in 2012 that they were going back to sourcing from local foods. And they got this grant to get the salad bar in, and they were so excited. And then the day that the salad bar got delivered, they realized they couldn't get it through the doorway into the cafeteria because the school, right, had engineered it in such a way that it was only that standard. And so we really have to think holistically about how we're going to get fresh food, healthy food back into our schools, and we have to have the resources there. And we have to think of it as an investment. This is not necessarily connected to schools, but HAFA has a program we call VeggieRx, where we actually work with doctors who identified food insecure families. And then for 23 to 27 weeks during the summertime into the fall, they get a CSA from us. And we actually delivered the CSA at the health clinic. So the family had to come to the health clinic to pick up the CSA box. And we did that intentionally because oftentimes food insecure families, folks who are, in a lot of stress anyways, when they think about the clinic, it's always negative, right? Because it's like there's something wrong with them, that's why they have to go to the clinic. And we wanted to change that association as well as build social capital and trust between the doctors and the patients. And the health clinic that worked with us, they did a social return and investment study. And they found for every dollar that was invested in the CSA program, they saw an additional $16.23 of additional economic activity. This is the investment that we are putting in our community, in our kids, in our families. But we have to change that mindset that it's something that's only foo-foo or luxury, or that's only something that, rich kids can do, because this is actually investing in our communities. Yeah, great question.
Hi. Oh my God, that's too loud.
Hello.
My name is Cheryl Williams, and I'm from Toledo, Ohio. And I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I left there in 2006, and I came in late on what you were saying about where Hmong people are. And I'm not sure I heard that you said Hmong people are in Milwaukee.
There are a lot.
Well, I know that, and yes, I had Hmong people as neighbors. And do you know if there's Hmong farmers there or urban farming there? I haven't been there in a while.
Totally, there is. So there's actually an organization in Milwaukee called the Fondi Food Center, and they run a lot of the farmers markets in both Milwaukee and Madison. They're a wonderful organization, a lot like MIF is here. And they are organizing a bunch of Hmong farmers. And in fact, they are organizing Hmong farmers to think about coming together and farming in a cooperative. There was a donor who had some land set aside that there was an opportunity to purchase that land, and they wanted to organize a cooperative among farmers to come and organize basically and run that cooperative. And so I think there's some really dynamic things that they're doing. The Hmong American Farmers Association, we actually got a federal grant to partner up with the Fondi Food Center to do some training around food safety. So there's a lot of good dynamic. But the Hmong farmers in Milwaukee, like the Hmong farmers in St. Paul, like the Hmong farmers in Missoula, the average age is 50 or 60 years old. Right? It's an aging population, just like mainstream, white farmers are. And so our challenge in Milwaukee, the challenge too, is how do we attract young farmers? And again, farmers who may not necessarily come from a farming background. But it's a very vibrant community in Milwaukee. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
My question is, do you enjoy eating watermelon?
I love watermelon. And can I tell you, I'm against MGO food, but when it comes to seedless watermelon, that is my one sin, but I'm learning that the ones that are seeded are actually a lot sweeter than the seedless ones, but I love watermelon.
I enjoy eating watermelon also. And watermelon is stereotyped with a black person. Have you ever heard of those stories about black man and watermelon?
I've heard of it, yes.
Yes. After slavery, black people could only grow watermelons at first. And they grew it well, because watermelon was originated from Africa. And of course, watermelon is a very tasty fruit, and it is eaten all over the world. But there are many black people today that will not eat watermelon because they're made fun of when they do eat it. People will laugh. And also, watermelon is Viagra. It's better than Viagra. So, yes. So we have had those, yes. So we have had those negative stereotypes. And I think we must understand that many people enjoy it all over the world. And it's very healthy for us. But yes, watermelon after slavery, many of the enslaved people grew it, and the white people got mad because they were really growing watermelons and selling them. Isn't that something?
That makes me so sad, right? And I think actually that's also part of why, and I think Jen was saying this, we have to tell our history. We have to tell how things came to be. Because that's sacred. Growing watermelon is actually very, very hard. You have to know about the right soil type, the conditions. You have to know about the weather. When to cut it, when to not. That should be a source of pride, not a source of embarrassment. And I also think that in many indigenous cultures, we're not just eating the watermelon, right? I know in my Hmong culture, they don't just eat the flesh, they're eating the rind. My aunt has an amazing dish of the rind of the watermelon. They have the leaves of the watermelon. When the watermelon has just come out, they have shoots that are very tender. People take some of those shoots and make a stir fry out of it. And so indigenous cultures use all parts of the plant. And that's what we need to relearn and then lift that up. So I want to thank you for sharing that story with us. Yeah, watermelon is amazing.
Do you think it is necessary for family farms to be better at their record keeping, their bookkeeping, their accounting practices?
So let me see if I heard you correctly. Do I think that it's important for farmers to do record keeping? Is that right? Yeah. I do think so. And the reason why I think so is because farming is a business. So let me step back a little bit. In Hmong culture, everybody farms. Because we came from a community that was an agrarian community, and so everybody did it. But in the United States, there are some folks who do it and they just do it for pleasure. Whatever they grow, they give it to their families. And then there are some who do it and it's their livelihood, it's their job, it's how they pay their mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. And when HAFA, the Hmong American Farmers Association, when we started, we needed to distinguish between those who were doing this as a livelihood and those that were just doing it as backyard farmers and just helping themselves. And we found that when you treat it like a business, you come to it with different types of self-interest. And farming is so hard that we hate to see our farmers working so hard, and then actually, when you do the delineation, you're losing money. We want people to be smart about it and to really, have dignity in their work. And so, because of that, I think that it is really important for us to record the data so that we can make smart decisions on how we grow the business. But that doesn't mean, though, that if you don't do that, I think you're a bad farmer. Because I think it's not just for beginning farmers or immigrant farmers. A lot of mainstream farmers don't have time, don't have the tools to actually do that really good recording. And I think actually that's why it's becoming on all of us to think about what are the right tools. Is it an app? Is it just calling into a hotline? What are different things that we can do to meet farmers where they're at? I know that for my parents in the peak season, I don't even see them at home. I mean, they're working like 10, 12-hour days. And then to say, oh, Dad, and by the way, you have to log all this stuff in that day, it's a little bit crazy. But how can we meet people like my dad halfway? I think that's important. What do you think? What caused you to ask that question?
So I work for Michigan State University Extension, and I work with farmers trying to help them do their accounting and financial analysis. Mm-hmm. And it's a hard thing for farmers, I know it is.
It is.
On another hand, it can be important if you need to get a loan for something and you need to go to your lender, you need to show them something.
Can I tell you a story? When we first started at HAFA, when we first started our business development program, there's an older woman, her name was Dur, and she was this amazing flower grower. And so she wanted to get a loan because she wanted to grow peonies, and she needed to show her financial statements. So we had her sit down, I interpreted, but we had her sit down with this older white gentleman. He was from the local community college, and he was an expert on farm business management. So we wrote down all of her assets. He would ask her questions, what is your rent, what is your mortgage, what do you own? And by the end of that whole thing, he's like, wow, your net worth is $600,000. And I remember she got up and she had pockets, she put on, she said, I don't have any money, but you're saying I'm worth $600,000? And her face, her body changed. And she was like, wow, she was so proud. And I will never forget that because all of it was just like in the air, but when we could see it and when we could tell her, it changed the way that she thought of herself. And I think that's really, really important. It is hard to do all of the record keeping, don't get me wrong. But when you do it and you can see the actual, the yield of your labor, it's so empowering. So remember that. One final question? Yeah.
I was wondering, how do we bring people to the table that do a lot of the labor and are very important, but maybe are afraid to participate because their legal status, or usually it's legal status or coming out. But I think that they need to have a voice, and I'm just curious about your ideas on how we can bring them to the table and show our appreciation.
That's a great question. And I'm gonna throw it back to you and say, let's not bring them to the table, let's go to them. Right? Yeah. I often think about, I was at a SARE conference talking to a bunch of SARE instructors, and this man, he was a really good, good heart, but he was saying, Pakou, we have all these boards, but we want our Latino farmers to be part of it, but they never come. And I was like, Larry, instead of having them come to your white table, why don't you go to their spaces, right? So is it a Latino church? Is it in the fields with them? You be the minority and understand where they're coming from before you invite them to your space. And he's like, but you're saying I shouldn't invite? And I said, no, you should, absolutely. But also change the power dynamics, right? And I think that's the first thing. And it sounds like you guys are there already. And then I also think that, you guys, we're all in this together. Let's be honest, right? If our workforce made up a lot of Latino workers are gone, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna grow the food? Right? So we're all in this together. So maybe we need to, maybe this sounds weird, but like we need to be the Underground Railroad for each other. We need to protect each other. We need to safeguard each other. We need to love and lift up each other. We need to fight for each other, right? In spaces where people can't be at. That's the only way, I think. Yeah. Last question? Yeah.
So I have super loud voice, so we all strive to grow this healthy food, and from that healthy food, we have healthy bodies and healthy families and healthy communities. My question is comment first, the soil can only give what it has. Can you talk for a minute on healthy soil as a foundation for all of this?
Totally. So the question is talking about healthy soils as a foundation, and I absolutely agree with you. And I think actually for a long time, we didn't see it that way, right? We actually we saw only production. We didn't see it in terms of ecosystem. And it's exactly actually the farmers in this room that probably always thought of ecosystem, right? But we bastardized it by only looking at production. So that's why we put all the synthetic stuff into the soil to make the seed grow, as opposed to seeing what is the ecosystem that actually is best suited for the soil. So I think the first thing is we have to change that mindset. And it's great that I think you guys were looking at the regenerative stuff that's gonna be going on, regenerative agriculture. That's so exciting. I think that's the new thing. I also think that when we talk about climate change, thinking about soil and soil sequestration and growing stuff and getting that CO2 from the air into the soil, that's really dynamic. But I also think this goes back to your question is we have to start at a young age for kids to understand soil is not dead, right? Soil is actually alive. Even for someone like me, the first time I remember grappling with that and thinking, wait a minute, so soil needs air? Like, yeah, I didn't, for the life of me, I didn't understand that. So I think we need to start young and educate people about the real dynamics of soil and think of it in the larger ecosystem. Right? But what about you? It sounds like you have a thought on that.
I'm a soil scientist, and I train on soil.
Right. And the question is, how many of those type of programs do we no longer have in the school systems, right? How many, whether it's 4-H or all those kind of agriculture or science-based extracurricular activities we no longer have because we're gearing towards testing. And this goes back to everything is interrelated, right? Why do we have bad schools why do we have bad food in the school systems, right? Why are people obese or sick? It's all interconnected. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much. It really has been an honor. I'm so jealous that you have this amazing community here. Thank you.